The coffee cup slipped from Robert Thompson's trembling fingers, shattering against the sterile hospital floor as Dr. Martinez's words hung in the air like a death sentence. His 71-year-old frame crumpled into the plastic chair, shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to echo through the cramped examination room. It wasn't just a pimple. It never had been. Eleanor reached for her husband's hand, her own surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her voice. "How long?" she whispered, though part of her, the nurse who'd spent 40 years at this very hospital, already knew the answer from the doctor's grave expression. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Bob's weathered face as tears carved rivers down his cheeks. 3 months ago, Eleanor had dismissed that tiny red spot on her neck as nothing more than old age catching up with her. "We need to start treatment immediately," Dr. Martinez said softly. But how had they missed all the signs? And would there be enough time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor May Patterson Thompson had always prided herself on being tougher than Texas leather. At 68, her silver hair was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn during her 40 years as a nurse at Houston Methodist Hospital, and her weathered hands still moved with the confidence of someone who'd seen every medical crisis imaginable. "I've seen worse, honey," was her favorite saying, delivered with a slight smile that had comforted thousands of patients over the decades. The modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street had been home for 15 years, its walls filled with memories of her late first husband and now her new life with Robert. She'd married Bob Thompson 2 years ago, finding unexpected love in her golden years after being widowed. He was a gentle giant of a man, a retired construction worker whose calloused hands could build anything but who treated her like precious china. Where Eleanor was stubborn as a mule, Bob was patient as a saint. Where she dismissed concerns with a wave of her hand, he worried quietly, his steel blue eyes reflecting decades of hard-earned wisdom about when to push and when to wait. Their daily routine was comfortable and predictable. Eleanor tended her prized rose garden each morning, the same flowers she'd been nurturing since moving to the neighborhood. She attended First Methodist Church every Sunday, where she'd served on the ladies' auxiliary for over a decade. Her grocery shopping was done with military precision, clipping coupons and comparing prices like the financial juggling act it had become since retirement. The truth was, money was tighter than she let on. Her nurse's pension and Social Security covered the basics, but the savings account had been steadily shrinking. Medicare helped, but it didn't cover everything, and the supplemental insurance premiums seemed to increase every year. She kept her financial worries to herself, counting and recounting the crumpled bills in her old cookie jar when Bob wasn't looking. Her relationship with her daughter Jennifer remained complicated, like an old wound that never quite healed. Jennifer was a successful corporate lawyer in Dallas, climbing the partnership ladder with the same determination Eleanor had once brought to her nursing career. But success had come at a cost. Missed holidays, hurried phone calls, and a distance that seemed to grow wider each year. Eleanor understood ambition, but she missed the little girl who used to help her plant flowers and listen wide-eyed to stories about saving lives at the hospital. Harold McKinnon, her 73-year-old neighbor, had become an unexpected source of comfort and companionship. A widower himself, he understood the delicate balance of starting over while honoring the past. His quiet presence in the garden next door, their conversations over the fence about everything and nothing, had become one of Eleanor's greatest pleasures, Bob noticed. And rather than jealousy, he felt gratitude that his wife had found another friend who could make her laugh. If Eleanor had learned anything from 4 decades of nursing, it was that the human body was both incredibly resilient and surprisingly fragile. She'd seen patients recover from seemingly impossible diagnoses, and she'd held hands with those facing the inevitable. What she'd never expected was how difficult it would be to apply that professional knowledge to herself. It was a Sunday morning in late September when Eleanor first noticed the small red bump on her neck while getting dressed for church. She paused in front of the bathroom mirror, tilting her head to get a better look at the spot just below her left ear. Her fingers, still steady despite her age, probed gently around the area. It felt slightly raised, no bigger than a pencil eraser, with an odd reddish color that stood out against her pale skin. "Just a pimple," she muttered to herself, applying a dab of concealer over the spot. "Happens at my age. Hormones don't care how old you get." She'd seen plenty of skin changes during her nursing career, and this looked like nothing more than a minor irritation. Perhaps it was from the new laundry detergent Bob had bought, or maybe the humid Texas weather was affecting her skin more than usual. Bob noticed her fiddling with her collar as they walked to church. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying that gentle concern that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Oh, just a little spot on my neck," Eleanor replied, adjusting her scarf to cover the area. "Nothing worth fussing over. You know how these things go. Probably be gone by next week." But Bob's expression didn't ease. He'd learned to read the subtle signs in Eleanor's voice, the way she dismissed things a little too quickly when they bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Maybe we should have Dr. Peterson take a look when you go for your checkup next month." "Robert Thompson," Eleanor said, using his full name the way she did when she wanted to make a point. "I've been a nurse longer than some doctors have been alive. If I thought it was something serious, don't you think I'd know?" She softened her tone and squeezed his arm. "I appreciate you looking out for me, but truly, it's nothing." During the church service, Eleanor found herself distracted, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the spot through her scarf. Reverend Williams was delivering a sermon about trusting in God's plan, but her mind kept wandering to the patients she'd cared for over the years. She remembered Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd come in with what looked like a harmless mole on her shoulder. Eleanor had been the one to suggest she have it checked, and it had turned out to be melanoma caught in its early stages. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived another 15 years because of that early detection. The irony wasn't lost on her, but somehow when it was her own body, the rules seemed different. She was Eleanor Patterson Thompson, the nurse who'd worked double shifts during flu epidemics, who'd held dying patients' hands and comforted grieving families. She'd seen real medical emergencies, life and death situations where every second counted. A small red bump on her neck hardly seemed worth the drama. That afternoon, she stopped by the drugstore and picked up some over-the-counter acne treatment. The teenage clerk looked at her curiously, clearly wondering why a 68-year-old woman was buying pimple cream, but Eleanor held her head high. Age was just a number, and skin problems could happen to anyone. Back home, she applied the cream carefully, studying her reflection in the magnifying mirror Bob had bought for her last Christmas. The spot looked a little angry, perhaps slightly larger than she'd first thought, but that could just be from her touching it. She made a mental note to leave it alone and let the medicine do its work. Harold was working in his garden when she went out to water her roses. They'd developed a comfortable routine of evening conversations over the fence that separated their properties, discussing everything from the weather to the state of the world. Today, however, he seemed more subdued than usual. "You doing all right, Harold?" Eleanor called out as she adjusted her sprinkler. He paused in his weeding and looked up at her with tired eyes. "Just thinking about my Martha today. Would have been her birthday." His late wife had been gone 3 years now, but certain dates still hit him hard. "She was a lovely woman," Eleanor said gently. "I still remember how she used to share her tomatoes with the whole neighborhood." Harold nodded. Then his expression grew more serious. "You know, she had a little mole on her back that she kept saying was nothing. Just like that, for months. By the time she finally let me drag her to the doctor." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Sometimes I wonder if things might have been different if she'd gone sooner." Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "Different people, different situations," she said quietly. But Harold's words echoed in her mind as she finished watering her garden. That night, as she performed her usual skincare routine, she examined the spot again. It definitely looked more irritated than it had that morning, and the skin around it seemed slightly swollen. She applied more of the acne cream, perhaps a bit more generously than the directions suggested. "How's that spot feeling?" Bob asked as he got ready for bed. "Fine," she replied automatically, then caught herself. Bob deserved honesty, even if she didn't want to worry him unnecessarily. "It's a little more noticeable than this morning, but that's probably just from the medicine working. Sometimes things get worse before they get better." Bob nodded, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He'd been married before, had lost his first wife to cancer 20 years ago. She knew he was probably remembering his own version of Harold's story, the small symptoms that had turned into something bigger. "Promise me something," he said, taking her hand. "If it doesn't start looking better in a week or two, will you at least call the doctor?" Eleanor squeezed his fingers. "I promise. But Bob, I really think you're both worrying over nothing. I've seen enough medical problems in my lifetime to know the difference between something serious and something minor." As she lay in bed that night, listening to Bob's steady breathing beside her, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Not just about the spot on her neck, but about everything. She'd always been the strong one, the caregiver, the person others turned to in medical crises. The idea that she might need taking care of felt foreign and uncomfortable. She touched the spot one more time through her pajama top, promising herself she'd leave it alone after tonight. Tomorrow she'd focus on other things. Her roses needed pruning, the church was organizing a food drive, and she wanted to call Jennifer to check on her granddaughter's first week of high school. But as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's dreams were filled with memories of patients she'd cared for, their faces blending together in a kaleidoscope of medical histories and outcomes. Some had recovered completely, others hadn't been so fortunate. In her dreams, she was both the nurse and the patient, observing and experiencing simultaneously, unable to shake the feeling that this small red spot was going to change everything. By the second week, Eleanor could no longer pretend the spot was improving. What had started as a small red bump was now noticeably larger, roughly the size of a dime, with an irregular shape that made her stomach clench with recognition. The acne cream had done nothing except irritate the surrounding skin, creating a ring of inflammation that made the whole area look angry and infected. She found herself checking it multiple times throughout the day, tilting the bathroom mirror to catch the light just right, hoping each time that it would somehow look better than the last inspection. Instead, it seemed to mock her professional experience with its persistent growth and the way it had begun to itch with an intensity that kept her awake at night. Bob's concern had escalated from gentle suggestions to more pointed observations. "Eleanor, honey, that thing on your neck looks worse than it did last week," he said one morning as she struggled to position her scarf to hide the increasingly obvious blemish. "These things take time to heal at our age," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She'd started avoiding the magnifying mirror altogether, relying instead on quick glances that couldn't capture the full extent of what was happening to her skin. The itching was the worst part. It started as a mild irritation during the day but became almost unbearable at night. She'd catch herself scratching at it unconsciously, which only made everything worse. Bob had begun gently pulling her hand away in their sleep, his own rest disturbed by her restless movements. "Maybe it's shingles," she suggested to Bob one evening after a particularly difficult day of trying to concentrate on anything other than the persistent itch. "That would explain the nerve pain and the way it's spreading." Bob looked up from his evening paper, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Shingles usually follows a specific pattern, doesn't it, along nerve pathways?" His question was gentle but pointed, He'd learned enough from living with a nurse to ask informed questions. Eleanor nodded reluctantly. She knew shingles typically presented as a band of blisters, usually on one side of the torso or face. What she had didn't follow that pattern at all. But admitting that meant acknowledging other, more troubling possibilities she wasn't ready to face. The third week brought new developments that made denial increasingly difficult. Two smaller spots had appeared near the original lesion, each one red and slightly raised, like satellites orbiting a planet. The main spot had developed an uneven texture, with areas that seemed to be scaling or flaking away, revealing raw skin underneath. Eleanor had stopped wearing her favorite blouses, the ones with lower necklines that she'd always thought were flattering. Now she favored high-collared shirts and scarves, creating elaborate arrangements that she hoped would disguise the growing problem. The effort exhausted her, and she found herself declining social invitations rather than deal with the stress of hiding her condition. The phone call with Jennifer that week had been particularly tense. Her daughter had called during her lunch break, squeezing in a quick conversation between depositions, and Eleanor had found herself snapping at perfectly reasonable questions. "How are you feeling, Mom? You sound tired," Jennifer had said, and something in her voice suggested she was picking up on more than Eleanor wanted to reveal. "I'm fine, Jennifer. Just busy with church activities and the garden," Eleanor had replied, but even she could hear the strain in her own voice. "Are you sure?" "Because you sound—" "I said I'm fine." The words came out sharper than Eleanor had intended, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken concerns. Jennifer's voice was careful when she spoke again. "Okay, Mom. But you know you can talk to me if something's wrong, right? I mean, I know we don't always, but if you needed something, I'd be there." The conversation had ended awkwardly, with both women saying goodbye too quickly, and Eleanor immediately regretting her defensive response. Jennifer had been trying for months to rebuild their relationship, and Eleanor's pride was getting in the way once again. That night, she sat in her bedroom with her laptop, something she'd resisted doing for weeks. Harold had mentioned his wife's experience, and while Eleanor had initially dismissed the comparison, the similarities were becoming harder to ignore. She typed "skin lesions" into the search bar, then quickly closed the browser window. She wasn't ready for whatever information she might find. Bob found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed laptop. "Doing some research?" he asked gently, settling beside her. "I was going to," she admitted. "But then I got scared of what I might read." It was the first time she'd acknowledged her fear aloud, and saying the words felt like opening a door she'd been desperately trying to keep closed. Bob put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Maybe it's time to let someone else take a look," he suggested, his voice careful and non-threatening. "Not because you don't know what you're doing, but because sometimes we're too close to our own problems to see them clearly." Eleanor leaned into his warmth, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I keep thinking about all the patients I've seen over the years who waited too long, the ones who came in saying, 'I thought it was nothing, nurse.'" "I didn't want to bother anyone." "And what did you tell them?" "That it's never a bother to check, that peace of mind is worth the appointment, even if it turns out to be nothing." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Funny how different it feels when it's your own body. The fourth week brought changes that even Eleanor's stubborn optimism couldn't explain away. The main lesion had doubled in size and developed an irregular border that seemed to change daily. The color had evolved from the original red to a mottled pattern of browns and blacks, with some areas that appeared almost translucent. More alarming were the physical symptoms that had begun to accompany the visual changes. The area around the lesion had become tender to the touch, and Eleanor had noticed swelling in the lymph nodes along her neck. Her nursing training kicked in despite her emotional resistance. Swollen lymph nodes meant the body was fighting something, and in the context of a suspicious skin lesion, that was never a good sign. The itching had been replaced by occasional sharp pains that seemed to radiate outward from the spot. Sometimes the pain was mild, easily ignored during busy moments, but other times it was sharp enough to make her gasp and press her hand to her neck involuntarily. Bob had stopped asking and started insisting. "Eleanor, I'm calling Dr. Peterson's office tomorrow morning," he announced after watching her wince during dinner. "This has gone on long enough." "Bob, No." His voice was firm in a way she rarely heard from him. "I lost my first wife because she was too proud to seek help early enough. I'm not going through that again, and I'm not letting you go through it either." The reference to his late wife stopped Eleanor's protests cold. Bob rarely talked about his first marriage, but she knew cancer had taken his wife after a long, difficult battle. The pain in his eyes told her this wasn't just about her health. It was about his own traumatic memories and his desperate need to protect the woman he'd found love with again. That night, Eleanor stood in front of the bathroom mirror and really looked at what was happening to her body. Without the protective filter of denial, the changes were undeniable and frightening. This wasn't a pimple, wasn't shingles, wasn't any of the minor conditions she'd tried to convince herself it might be. She was a nurse. She'd seen enough suspicious lesions to recognize the warning signs she'd been systematically ignoring. The irregular shape, the color changes, the rapid growth, the satellite lesions, everything pointed to a diagnosis she wasn't ready to face but could no longer deny. With trembling fingers, she reached for the phone to call Dr. Peterson's office, but then remembered it was past 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. The call would have to wait until morning, which meant another sleepless night of watching the clock and trying not to think about all the possibilities her medical knowledge was suggesting. As she lay in bed beside Bob, listening to his steady breathing and feeling his warmth next to her, Eleanor finally allowed herself to admit what she'd been fighting for 4 weeks. She was scared, and she needed help. The community health clinic on Baker Street wasn't where Eleanor had imagined receiving medical care in her retirement years. The waiting room was cramped and outdated, with mismatched chairs and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. But it was what their budget could handle, especially with the Medicare enrollment period still weeks away and their supplemental insurance offering limited coverage for specialist visits. Dr. Kim looked impossibly young as he entered the examination room, his white coat still crisp with newness and his manner eager but inexperienced. Eleanor guessed he couldn't be more than 30, probably fresh out of residency and still learning to navigate the complexities of real-world medicine. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. She remembered how overwhelming those early years could be for young doctors. "Mrs. Thompson, I see you're concerned about a skin lesion, Dr. Kim said, settling onto his rolling stool and opening her thin file. "How long have you been noticing this?" "About a month now," Eleanor replied, unconsciously touching the scarf she'd wrapped carefully around her neck. "It started small, but it's been growing and changing." When she finally unwrapped the scarf and revealed the lesion, Dr. Kim's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. He examined the area with a handheld magnifying glass, his touch gentle but thorough. Eleanor watched his face carefully, using her decades of nursing experience to read the subtle signs of his assessment. "Well, Mrs. Thompson, this looks like contact dermatitis to me," he said with what Eleanor recognized as misplaced confidence. "Have you been using any new soaps, detergents, or skincare products recently?" Bob shifted in his chair, and Eleanor could feel his skepticism radiating across the small room. "Doctor," Bob said carefully, "my wife was a nurse for 40 years. She's seen a lot of skin conditions, and she's concerned this might be something more serious." Dr. Kim's smile was patronizing in the way that made Eleanor's teeth clench. "I appreciate Mrs. Thompson's experience, but sometimes medical professionals can overthink their own symptoms." What we have here is classic contact dermatitis, probably from an allergen or irritant. The irregular appearance is just inflammation from scratching. Eleanor felt her professional pride bristle at the dismissal, but she also recognized the dangerous appeal of his diagnosis. Contact dermatitis was treatable, manageable, nothing to lose sleep over. Part of her desperately wanted to believe him, to take the prescribed steroid cream and pretend everything would be fine. "I'll prescribe a topical corticosteroid," Dr. Kim continued, already scribbling on his prescription pad. "Use it twice daily for 2 weeks, and if there's no improvement, we can try a stronger formulation. Avoid any potential irritants in the meantime, maybe switch to a hypoallergenic laundry detergent." Walking out of the clinic, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and nagging doubt. Bob's silence in the car spoke volumes about his own concerns, but neither of them wanted to voice their reservations about the young doctor's casual dismissal. For the next 10 days, Eleanor followed Dr. Kim's instructions religiously. She applied the steroid cream twice daily, switched to fragrance-free products, and even bought new pillowcases made from organic cotton. She wanted desperately for the treatment to work, checking the mirror each morning with hope that gradually diminished as the days passed. Instead of improving, the lesion seemed to respond to the steroid treatment by becoming more aggressive. The cream appeared to thin the skin around the area, making the underlying changes more visible and somehow more ominous. The satellite lesions that had appeared in week 4 were now clearly defined, and new ones seemed to be emerging along what Eleanor recognized as lymphatic pathways. Harold noticed the change during one of their evening garden conversations. "Eleanor, honey, are you feeling all right?" "You look a bit peaked," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Just fighting off something," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she'd begun to feel generally unwell. Nothing dramatic, but a persistent fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activity level. "You know," Harold said, leaning against the fence post, "Martha had something similar on her back a few years before. Well, before. Started small, kept growing despite the creams the first doctor gave her. Wasn't until she saw a specialist that we got answers." The weight of his words settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. She'd been avoiding thinking about Harold's wife, about the parallels between their situations, but his gentle reminder forced her to confront what she'd been denying. That night she finally opened her laptop and began researching her symptoms in earnest. What she found made her stomach turn and her hands shake as she scrolled through medical websites and images that looked disturbingly familiar. The irregular borders, the color variations, the satellite lesions, the rapid growth, everything pointed to a diagnosis that her nursing experience had been whispering for weeks. Bob found her in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, sitting at the table with medical textbooks spread around her laptop. These were books she'd kept from her nursing school days, references she'd consulted countless times during her career, but never for her own condition. "What are you finding?" he asked gently, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think Dr. Kim was wrong, Bob. I think this is melanoma." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Bob reached for her hand, and she was surprised to find his fingers trembling as much as hers. "The textbook says melanoma can present with irregular borders, color variation, and satellite lesions," she continued, pointing to a page she'd been studying. "And look at these photos. They look exactly like what I have." Bob studied the images, his construction worker's practical mind processing the visual evidence. "So, what do we do now?" "We need to see a dermatologist," Eleanor said, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "A real specialist, not a resident who's probably never seen advanced skin cancer." The next morning, Eleanor called Dr. Peterson's office to request a referral to a dermatologist. The conversation with the receptionist was frustrating. The earliest available appointment was 6 weeks away, and that was only if she was willing to see a physician's assistant instead of the doctor. 6 weeks? Eleanor repeated, feeling panic rise in her throat. But this could be— I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but Dr. Martinez is very popular. She's the only dermatologist in the county who takes Medicare patients, so her schedule fills up quickly. Eleanor hung up the phone, feeling defeated. 6 weeks felt like an eternity when every day brought visible changes to the lesion. She looked at Bob, who had been listening to her end of the conversation with growing concern. "Maybe we should go to the emergency room," he suggested. "They could at least take a look and tell us if it's urgent." Eleanor shook her head. "Emergency rooms don't handle routine dermatology cases. They'd probably just refer us back to a specialist and send us home with more steroid cream." The weight of the American healthcare system pressed down on them both. Eleanor had spent her career working within this system, understanding its limitations and bureaucracies, but experiencing it as a patient felt completely different. The insurance requirements, the referral processes, the scheduling delays, everything seemed designed to delay care rather than provide it. That afternoon, Jennifer called during her lunch break, as had become her routine over the past few weeks. Eleanor had been avoiding talking about her health concerns, but something in her daughter's voice suggested she was picking up on the stress. "Mom, you sound tired again," Jennifer said. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Eleanor looked at Bob, who nodded encouragingly. Maybe it was time to let Jennifer know what was happening, to stop protecting her from worry that might be justified. "Actually, Jennifer, I need to tell you something," Eleanor began, and found herself explaining the past month's events, the lesion, the failed treatment, her growing concerns, and the frustrating delays in getting specialist care. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Jennifer's voice came through, tight with emotion and determination. "Mom, I'm coming home this weekend, and I'm calling some colleagues who specialize in medical malpractice. They'll know which doctors in Houston are worth seeing and how to get you an appointment quickly." "Jennifer, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Jennifer interrupted. "I've been a terrible daughter, too busy with my career to pay attention to what really matters. But I'm paying attention now, and we're going to get you the care you need." After hanging up, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that she wouldn't be facing this alone, guilt for worrying her daughter, and a growing certainty that her worst fears were about to be confirmed. That evening, as she and Bob sat on their porch watching the sunset, Eleanor finally voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Bob, what if it's too late? What if all this delay means we've missed our chance?" Bob took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "Then we'll deal with whatever comes next together. But don't give up before we even know what we're fighting." His words were meant to comfort, but Eleanor's nursing experience provided a sobering context. She knew that with melanoma, time was everything, and they might have already lost too much of it. Jennifer's determination proved more effective than months of bureaucratic navigation. By Wednesday morning, she had secured an appointment with Dr. Sarah Martinez at Houston Methodist Hospital's dermatology department, the same hospital where Eleanor had spent 4 decades of her nursing career. The irony of returning as a patient to the place where she'd cared for countless others wasn't lost on her, and the familiar hallways felt both comforting and unsettling as she walked through them with Bob by her side. Dr. Martinez's office was everything the community clinic had not been: spacious, well-lit, and equipped with state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment. The walls were lined with diplomas and certifications that spoke to years of specialized training, and Eleanor felt her first real surge of hope since this ordeal had begun. This was where she would finally get answers. When Dr. Martinez entered the examination room, Eleanor was struck by the woman's presence. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with graying hair pulled back in a professional chignon and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something familiar about her, though Eleanor couldn't quite place where she might have seen her before. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Martinez said, extending her hand with a firm, confident grip. "I understand you have some concerns about a lesion on your neck." Eleanor nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. This moment felt pivotal, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. "I've reviewed your file from Dr. Kim," Dr. Martinez continued, settling onto her stool and wheeling closer to Eleanor. "He diagnosed contact dermatitis and prescribed topical corticosteroids. How did you respond to that treatment?" "It got worse," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Much worse." The unwrapping of the scarf felt ceremonial, like revealing something sacred and terrible. Eleanor had been hiding the lesion for so long that exposing it to professional scrutiny felt both terrifying and liberating. Dr. Martinez's face remained professionally neutral as Eleanor revealed the full extent of what had been growing on her neck, but Eleanor caught the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. Dr. Martinez examined the lesion with a dermatoscope, a specialized instrument that magnified and illuminated the skin with polarized light. The examination was thorough and silent, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath as the doctor moved the instrument across the affected area, studying it from multiple angles. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eleanor watched Dr. Martinez's face intently, using her nursing experience to read the subtle changes in expression, the slight furrow of concentration, the way her lips pressed together almost imperceptibly. Finally, Dr. Martinez sat back and set down the dermatoscope. When she looked at Eleanor, her expression was grave. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to be very direct with you," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "This lesion has several characteristics that are extremely concerning for melanoma. The irregular border, the color variation, the satellite lesions, and the rapid growth pattern all point to an aggressive form of skin cancer." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting them. Hearing her worst fears confirmed by a specialist made them real in a way that her own suspicions had not. Bob made a small sound beside her, something between a gasp and a moan. "How certain are you?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I'd estimate about 90% certainty based on the visual examination," Dr. Martinez replied. "But we need a biopsy to confirm the diagnosis and determine the exact type and depth of the melanoma. I want to do that today, right now, if you're agreeable." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The biopsy procedure was relatively quick, but seemed to take forever. Dr. Martinez worked with practiced efficiency, numbing the area and taking multiple samples from different parts of the lesion. Each small cut felt like another step toward a future Eleanor wasn't ready to face. "The pathology results will take about a week," Dr. Martinez explained as she bandaged the biopsy sites. "But based on what I'm seeing, I want to schedule you for additional imaging studies immediately. We need to determine if there's any spread to lymph nodes or other organs." Bob finally found his voice. "What are we looking at here, doctor? What's the prognosis?" "Doctor." Martinez's expression was compassionate but honest. "Without the pathology results, I can't give you definitive staging information. But if this is melanoma, and if it's as advanced as it appears to be, we're likely looking at stage 3, possibly stage 4. That means it may have spread beyond the original site." Eleanor felt the room spinning slightly. Stage 3 melanoma had a 5-year survival rate of about 50%. Stage 4 was much worse. As a nurse, she knew these statistics intimately, had delivered similar news to families countless times. Being on the receiving end felt surreal and terrifying. "What's the next step?" she asked. drawing on years of professional experience to focus on practical matters when emotions threaten to overwhelm her. We schedule the imaging studies for this week: CT scan, PET scan, possibly MRI, depending on what we find. Once we have all the information, we can discuss treatment options with the oncology team. The mention of oncology made everything feel more real and more frightening. Eleanor had worked closely with the oncology department during her nursing career, had seen patients fight this battle with varying degrees of success. Now she was about to become one of those patients. As they left the hospital, Eleanor felt numb and disconnected from her surroundings. The familiar hallways that had once been her second home now seemed foreign and threatening. Bob's hand in hers was the only thing that felt real and solid in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. The drive home was mostly silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts and fears. When they pulled into their driveway, Eleanor noticed Harold working in his garden, and the normalcy of the scene felt almost absurd given what they'd just learned. "Should we tell him?" Bob asked, following her gaze. "Not yet," Eleanor replied. "I need some time to process this myself before I start telling people." That evening, Eleanor called Jennifer to update her on the appointment. Her daughter's reaction was swift and decisive. "I'm taking leave from the firm," Jennifer announced. "I'm coming home to help with whatever you need, doctor appointments, treatment, whatever it takes." "Jennifer, you don't need to sacrifice your career, go. My career will still be there when this is over," Jennifer interrupted. "My mother might not be. I'm not missing this chance to be there for you." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering practical matters like medical insurance, treatment options, and logistics. It was the longest conversation Eleanor and Jennifer had shared in years, and despite the terrible circumstances, Eleanor felt grateful for this unexpected opportunity to reconnect with her daughter. After hanging up the phone, Eleanor and Bob sat together on their couch, not speaking but drawing comfort from each other's presence. The future felt uncertain and frightening, but at least they weren't facing it alone. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about all the patients she'd cared for over the years who had received similar diagnoses. Some had fought the disease and won, living full lives despite their cancer diagnosis. Others had lost their battles, but had found meaning and peace in their final months. She thought about the promises she'd made to herself and to Bob when they got married, that they would face whatever challenges life brought them together. She'd imagined those challenges might include the normal health issues of aging, but she'd never prepared herself for something this serious, this potentially life-threatening. As dawn approached, Eleanor made a decision. Whatever the pathology results revealed, whatever the staging showed, she was going to fight this disease with everything she had. She had too much to live for: her marriage to Bob, her relationship with Jennifer, the possibility of seeing her granddaughter grow up, the simple pleasures of her garden and her community. The lesion on her neck had started as something she'd dismissed as insignificant, but it had become the catalyst for facing her own mortality and reconnecting with the people she loved most. In a strange way, she felt grateful for that wake-up call, even as she feared what it might ultimately mean for her future. The next week would bring definitive answers, and with those answers would come decisions about treatment, about how to spend whatever time she had left, about what really mattered in the face of life's ultimate uncertainty. The call came on a Friday morning while Eleanor was tending to her roses, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while waiting for the pathology results. The sharp ring of the phone cut through the peaceful morning air like a blade, and Eleanor knew with gut-wrenching certainty that this was the call she'd been both waiting for and dreading. Dr. Martinez's voice was gentle but direct when Eleanor answered. "Mrs. Thompson, could you and your husband come in this afternoon? I have your results, and I'd prefer to discuss them in person." The fact that Dr. Martinez wanted to see them in person rather than deliver the news over the phone told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the severity of the situation. Good news was typically shared quickly over the phone. Bad news required face-to-face conversations, tissues, and time for questions. Eleanor's hands trembled as she hung up the phone and called to Bob, who was replacing a broken fence board in the backyard. When she told him about the call, his face went pale, and the hammer slipped from his fingers to land with a dull thud in the grass. The afternoon appointment felt like walking toward an execution. Eleanor had dressed carefully in her best navy dress, the one she wore to church on Easter and Christmas, as if proper attire could somehow influence the news they were about to receive. Bob wore his only suit, the one from their wedding 2 years ago, and his hands shook slightly as he knotted his tie. Dr. Martinez's office felt different this time, smaller, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around them. When the doctor entered, her expression was grave, and Eleanor noticed she had a box of tissues strategically placed within reach on her desk. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Dr. Martinez began, settling into her chair and meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. "The pathology confirms our worst fears. You have stage 3 melanoma with lymph node involvement. The tumor has a Breslow thickness of 4.2 millimeters, which indicates it has grown quite deep into the skin layers." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. A Breslow thickness over 4 millimeters was considered high risk, associated with significantly increased chances of metastasis and decreased survival rates. Her nursing knowledge provided the clinical context that made the news even more terrifying. "The PET scan shows involvement of multiple lymph nodes in your neck and possibly your armpit region," Dr. Martinez continued. "We haven't detected any distant metastases yet, which means it hasn't spread to your organs, but the extensive lymph node involvement puts you at stage 3B. Bob made a strangled sound and gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Eleanor reached for his hand, finding it cold and clammy with shock. "What does that mean for treatment?" Eleanor asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in her mind. "We need to move very quickly," Dr. Martinez replied. "I'm recommending immediate surgery to remove the primary tumor and perform a lymph node dissection. After surgery, you'll need adjuvant therapy, likely immunotherapy or targeted therapy depending on additional genetic testing of the tumor." The doctor continued explaining the treatment protocol, but Eleanor found it difficult to focus on the details. Words like wide excision, lymphadenectomy, and interferon therapy floated around her like debris in a storm. She'd heard these terms countless times during her nursing career, but hearing them applied to her own case felt surreal and terrifying. "Doctor," Bob interrupted, his voice hoarse with emotion, "what are we looking at here? What are her chances?" Dr. Martinez paused, and Eleanor could see her choosing her words carefully. "Stage 3B melanoma has a 5-year survival rate of approximately 59%. However, these are just statistics, and every case is individual. With aggressive treatment, some patients do very well. 59%. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. It meant that 4 out of 10 people with her diagnosis wouldn't be alive in 5 years. The professional part of her mind automatically calculated the implications. If the cancer had progressed this far already, if the lymph nodes were involved, if the tumor was as deep as indicated, her prognosis might be even worse than the average. Bob suddenly doubled over in his chair, his face contorting with anguish. "Oh, God," he whispered. Then louder, "Oh, God, no." His shoulders began shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Eleanor had seen this reaction before, countless times, from family members receiving devastating news. But experiencing it from the other side, watching her husband's heart break in real time, was almost worse than hearing her own diagnosis. "Bob," she said gently, reaching over to stroke his back. "Bob, look at me." When he finally raised his head, his eyes were red and streaming with tears. "I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't go through this again." The reference to his first wife's battle with cancer hung heavy in the air. Eleanor realized that for Bob, this diagnosis was triggering not just current fear, but also traumatic memories of watching someone he loved suffer and die from disease. Dr. Martinez allowed them a moment to process before continuing with the practical details. "I've already spoken with Dr. Patricia Williams, our surgical oncologist, and she can see you Monday morning. If you agree to surgery, we can schedule it for later next week." "How extensive will the surgery be?" Eleanor asked, trying to focus on the medical details rather than the emotional devastation playing out beside her. "We'll need to remove the tumor with wide margins, probably a 2-centimeter border all around the lesion. We'll also perform a modified radical neck dissection to remove the affected lymph nodes. It will require general anesthesia and probably a 2-3-day hospital stay." Eleanor nodded, her mind automatically cataloging the implications. The surgery would leave her with significant scarring and possible nerve damage. The lymph node removal could cause permanent swelling and limited range of motion in her arm. But these seemed like minor concerns compared to the alternative. "And after surgery?" she pressed. "Recovery will take several weeks, and then we'll start adjuvant therapy. The exact protocol will depend on genetic testing of the tumor tissue, but likely either immunotherapy drugs like pembrolizumab or targeted therapy if you have specific genetic mutations." The financial implications crashed over Eleanor like a wave. Immunotherapy drugs could cost tens of thousands of dollars per month. Even with Medicare, the copays and deductibles would be astronomical. They would likely have to sell their house, drain their savings, and possibly burden Jennifer with debt. As if reading her mind, Dr. Martinez added, "I know the financial aspects of treatment can be overwhelming. We have social workers who specialize in helping patients navigate insurance coverage and find financial assistance programs." The appointment continued for another 30 minutes, covering logistics, timelines, and next steps. Eleanor found herself slipping into professional mode, asking practical questions about side effects, recovery times, and long-term monitoring. It was easier to focus on the clinical details than to fully absorb the emotional reality of what she was facing. When they finally left the office, Bob was still visibly shaken, and Eleanor felt strangely disconnected from her own emotions. They drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about an uncertain future. That evening, Eleanor called Jennifer to share the news. Her daughter's reaction was swift and fierce. "I'm flying home tonight," Jennifer announced. "I'm going to be there for every appointment, every treatment, every step of this fight." "Jennifer, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Jennifer interrupted, her voice thick with tears. "I've been a selfish daughter, too focused on my career to see what really matters. But I see it now, Mom. I see it clearly." After the phone call, Eleanor sat in her garden as the sun set, surrounded by the roses she'd tended for so many years. The familiar routine of checking for aphids and deadheading spent blooms felt both comforting and poignant. Would she be here to see these flowers bloom again next spring? Bob found her there as darkness fell, and they sat together on the garden bench he'd built for her last Christmas. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of an uncertain future. "We're going to fight this," Eleanor said finally, her voice firm with determination she didn't entirely feel. Bob took her hand and squeezed it. "Together," he replied. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." But even as they made promises to each other about fighting and staying strong, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of an abyss, about to begin a journey from which there might be no return. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday morning, and Eleanor spent the preceding days putting her affairs in order with the methodical precision that had served her well during 40 years of nursing. She updated her will, organized her medical records, and prepared detailed instructions for Bob about everything from her medications to the care of her rose garden. It felt morbid, but her professional experience had taught her the importance of being prepared for any outcome. Jennifer arrived Tuesday evening, and the reunion with her daughter was both joyful and heartbreaking. Eleanor hadn't realized how much weight Jennifer had lost until she saw her standing in the doorway, dark circles under her eyes, and an expression of determined resolve mixed with barely contained grief. "Oh, Mom," Jennifer whispered, embracing Eleanor with a desperation that spoke to years of regret and missed opportunities. The preoperative appointment with Dr. Patricia Williams on Wednesday morning provided more sobering details about the extent of the surgery. The modified radical neck dissection would involve removing 30 to 40 lymph nodes, along with surrounding tissue and possibly parts of muscles and nerves depending on what they found during the operation. "There's a risk of permanent nerve damage," Dr. Williams explained, her manner professional but compassionate. "You might experience weakness in your shoulder, numbness in parts of your face and neck, or difficulty swallowing. We'll do everything possible to preserve function, but removing all the cancer tissue is our primary concern." Eleanor nodded, understanding that disfigurement and disability were small prices to pay for the chance at survival. But when she looked at Bob's stricken face, she realized he was struggling with the idea of watching her suffer through what might ultimately prove to be futile treatment. The evening before surgery, Harold appeared at their door with a casserole and an awkward expression of concern. Eleanor had finally told him about her diagnosis the previous weekend, and his reaction had been a mixture of devastation and guilt about his late wife's similar battle. "I keep thinking I should have pushed Martha harder to see a doctor sooner," he confessed as they sat on the porch together. "Maybe if I'd been more insistent." "You can't blame yourself for things you couldn't control," Eleanor replied, though she wondered privately if the same advice applied to her own delay in seeking treatment. The night before surgery, Eleanor lay awake listening to Bob's restless breathing beside her. Neither of them was sleeping well, and the darkness seemed full of unspoken fears about what tomorrow might bring. At some point during the long hours before dawn, Bob spoke into the quiet room. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Williams said about the risks," he began hesitantly, "about the possibility that the surgery might not be enough." Eleanor turned to face him in the dim light filtering through their bedroom curtains. "Are you asking me to reconsider the surgery? I'm asking if you've thought about what you want if the treatment doesn't work. If you want to fight until the very end, or if there's a point where you'd rather focus on making whatever time we have left as good as possible." It was a conversation Eleanor had dreaded but knew they needed to have. Her nursing experience had shown her that end-of-life decisions were often made in crisis moments when clear thinking was impossible. Better to discuss these things while she still had time to consider her options rationally. "I want to fight, Bob. I want to try everything reasonable. But I don't want to spend my final months suffering through treatments that only buy a few weeks or days." They talked until sunrise about living wills, about quality versus quantity of life, about their hopes and fears for whatever time remained to them. It was the most honest conversation they'd ever had about mortality, and despite the circumstances, Eleanor felt grateful for the intimacy it created between them. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with a persistent drizzle that matched Eleanor's mood as they drove to the hospital. Jennifer met them in the preoperative area, having spent the night in a nearby hotel, and her presence provided comfort that Eleanor hadn't expected. The pre-surgical routine was familiar from her nursing days, but felt completely different from the patient's perspective. The hospital gown that she'd helped thousands of patients into over the years now felt exposing and vulnerable on her own body. The IV insertion, the identification bracelet, the surgical site marking, all procedures she'd assisted with countless times but had never experienced herself. Dr. Williams stopped by for a final consultation before Eleanor was wheeled into the operating room. "We'll know more about the extent of the cancer once we can examine the lymph nodes directly," she explained. "If we find more involvement than expected, the surgery might take longer, but we'll remove everything we can safely access." Eleanor nodded, trying to maintain the composure that had served her well throughout her career. But when the anesthesiologist began administering the medications that would render her unconscious, she felt a moment of panic about whether she would ever wake up again. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours, much longer than the 3 to 4 hours originally estimated. Jennifer and Bob spent the time in the surgical waiting room, pacing and drinking bad coffee, and trying to read magazines without absorbing any of the words on the pages. Harold joined them partway through the day, having driven to the hospital despite his own emotional difficulty with medical settings. His presence was comforting to Bob, who was struggling with flashbacks to his first wife's surgical experiences. When Dr. Williams finally emerged from the operating room, her expression was grim. She still wore her surgical scrubs, and Eleanor could see traces of fatigue around her eyes that spoke to the complexity of the operation. "The surgery went well technically," Dr. Williams began, settling into a chair across from them in a small consultation room. "But we found more lymph node involvement than we anticipated from the imaging studies." Jennifer gripped Bob's hand tightly as they waited for more details. "We removed 42 lymph nodes in total, and 28 of them showed cancer involvement. The tumor had also grown into some of the surrounding muscle tissue, which we had to remove. Mrs. Thompson will have significant scarring and some permanent functional limitations, but we believe we got all the visible cancer." Bob's face went ashen. "What does that mean for her prognosis?" Dr. Williams hesitated before answering. "The extensive lymph node involvement means we're looking at stage 3C melanoma, which is more advanced than we initially thought. The 5-year survival rate for stage 3C is approximately 40%. The number hit them like a physical blow. 40% meant that 6 out of 10 people with Eleanor's diagnosis would not survive 5 years. The odds had shifted decisively against her, and everyone in the room understood the implications. "However, Dr. Williams continued, "the fact that we were able to achieve what appears to be complete surgical resection is encouraging. With aggressive adjuvant therapy, some patients with similar presentations do very well." Jennifer found her voice first. "What's the next step?" "Recovery from this surgery will take several weeks. Once Mrs. Thompson has healed sufficiently, we'll start immunotherapy. The genetic testing of her tumor tissue showed she's a good candidate for pembrolizumab, which has shown promising results in melanoma patients with her molecular profile." Eleanor spent the next 3 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness on pain medications and trying to come to terms with her altered body. The surgical site extended from below her ear to her collarbone, held together with dozens of staples that would eventually be removed. The left side of her neck felt numb and strange, and she had limited range of motion in her left arm. More challenging than the physical changes was the psychological adjustment to her new reality. Stage 3C melanoma with extensive lymph node involvement was a formidable opponent, and Eleanor's medical knowledge provided no comfort about her chances of long-term survival. But when she looked at Bob and Jennifer, who had barely left her bedside during her hospitalization, Eleanor felt a renewed determination to fight for whatever time she could have with the people she loved. The surgery was just the beginning of a long battle, but at least she wouldn't be fighting it alone. The pathology report that arrived the day before her discharge provided additional sobering details about the aggressiveness of her cancer, but it also confirmed that the surgical margins were clear and that no distant metastases had been detected during the operation. As Eleanor prepared to leave the hospital, she realized that everything about her life had changed in the span of a few months. The woman who had entered the hospital was different from the one preparing to leave, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually as well. 3 weeks after surgery, Eleanor sat in the oncology waiting room for her first immunotherapy consultation, feeling more fragile and uncertain than she had at any point in her adult life. The surgical incision had healed well physically, but the emotional wounds felt raw and overwhelming. The financial reality of her treatment had become crushingly apparent when the first insurance statement arrived, showing charges of over $40,000 for the surgery alone, with her portion of the costs exceeding $8,000. Bob had been quietly researching their options, and the conversations they'd been having about money were breaking both their hearts. Their modest savings account, intended to last through their retirement years, would be depleted within months of starting the immunotherapy treatments. The house they'd called home for 15 years would likely need to be sold, and even then, the proceeds might not be enough to cover the full course of treatment. "Maybe we should consider the clinical trial option," Bob suggested gently as they waited for Dr. Rodriguez, the oncologist who would be managing Eleanor's immunotherapy. The treatment would be free, and it might be just as effective as the standard therapy. Eleanor nodded, though the idea of being a test subject for experimental cancer treatment felt frightening. Clinical trials meant uncertainty, unknown side effects, and the possibility of receiving a placebo instead of active treatment. But they also represented hope for patients who had exhausted other options, and the financial relief would allow them to keep their home. Dr. Rodriguez turned out to be a compassionate woman in her 50s who had been treating melanoma patients for over 20 years. She reviewed Eleanor's pathology reports and surgical notes with the thoroughness of someone who understood that every detail mattered when dealing with aggressive cancer. "Your tumor showed high levels of PD-L1 expression, which makes you an excellent candidate for immunotherapy," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The standard treatment would be pembrolizumab every 3 weeks for up to 2 years, assuming you don't have disease progression." Eleanor felt her heart sink as Dr. Rodriguez continued with the financial details. Even with Medicare and their supplemental insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for the standard treatment would be approximately $3,000 per month. Over 2 years, they would owe more than $70,000 in addition to the surgical costs they were already struggling to manage. "However," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "there's a clinical trial that might be perfect for you. We're testing a combination of pembrolizumab with a newer immunotherapy drug that has shown promising results in early studies. The trial would cover all treatment costs, and you'd receive some of the most cutting-edge melanoma therapy available." Eleanor and Bob exchanged glances, both understanding that they really had no choice. The clinical trial represented their only realistic path forward, both medically and financially. But when they returned home that afternoon, they discovered that Jennifer had been busy making her own plans. She was waiting for them in their kitchen, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, her laptop open to what appeared to be real estate listings. "I've been doing some research," Jennifer announced without preamble. "I'm selling my condo in Dallas and liquidating my investment portfolio. That should cover your treatment costs for the first year, and I'm confident I can figure out funding for the second year." Eleanor stared at her daughter in shock. "Jennifer, you can't sacrifice your financial security for me. That condo is your home, and those investments are your retirement fund. What good is financial security if I lose my mother because we couldn't afford treatment?" Jennifer replied, her voice firm with determination. "I'm 38 years old, Mom. I have time to rebuild my savings. You don't have time to wait for insurance bureaucracy or clinical trial lotteries." Bob looked between the two women, understanding that this was a conversation that had been building for years. The guilt Eleanor felt about Jennifer's sacrifice was evident in every line of her face, but the love and determination in her daughter's eyes made it clear that this decision was non-negotiable. Besides, Jennifer continued, I've been thinking about making some changes in my life anyway. I've been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that I've missed out on what really matters. Maybe this is an opportunity for both of us to reassess our priorities. The conversation that followed was emotional and difficult, touching on years of missed connections and misplaced priorities. Eleanor finally understood that Jennifer's apparent indifference over the years had been a defensive mechanism, a way of protecting herself from the disappointment of feeling like her mother's career always came first. I remember being 8 years old and having to go to the hospital with Dad when you were working double shifts, Jennifer said, tears streaming down her face. I used to sit in the waiting room doing homework, watching other kids with their moms, wondering if your patients were more important to you than I was. Eleanor felt her heart break as she realized how her dedication to her nursing career had been perceived by her daughter. Jennifer, I was working those extra shifts to pay for your dance lessons, your college fund, all the things I thought would give you a better life. I didn't need dance lessons, Jennifer replied. I needed my mother. The conversation continued deep into the evening, with both women finally expressing decades of hurt and misunderstanding. Bob listened mostly in silence, occasionally offering gentle observations that helped keep the discussion productive rather than destructive. By the time they went to bed that night, something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamics. Eleanor had agreed to let Jennifer help with the treatment costs, but only after Jennifer promised to be realistic about her own financial future. They would pursue the standard immunotherapy treatment rather than the clinical trial, giving Eleanor the best possible chance at survival. The first immunotherapy infusion was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Eleanor spent the weekend researching the potential side effects and trying to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. Pembrolizumab was known to cause fatigue, nausea, and skin reactions, but it could also trigger more serious autoimmune responses that required immediate medical attention. Harold had become a daily visitor, bringing meals and offering to help with yard work and household chores. His quiet presence was comforting to both Eleanor and Bob, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the friendship that had developed over the past months. You know, Harold said one afternoon as they sat together on the porch, Martha always said that cancer taught her what really mattered in life. She said she was grateful for the clarity it brought, even though she hated the disease. Eleanor understood what he meant. The cancer diagnosis had stripped away the pretenses and minor concerns that had occupied so much of her mental energy before. Suddenly, every conversation with loved ones felt precious, every sunset more beautiful, every small kindness more meaningful. The night before her first treatment, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. The small red spot she'd dismissed for so long, the delays in seeking treatment, the devastating diagnosis, the major surgery, and now the beginning of what would likely be a 2-year battle with powerful medications that might or might not save her life. But she also thought about the unexpected gifts the cancer had brought. Her relationship with Jennifer was stronger than it had been in decades. Her marriage to Bob had deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her friendship with Harold had provided comfort and perspective she wouldn't have had otherwise. As dawn approached, Eleanor made peace with the uncertainty that lay ahead. She couldn't control whether the immunotherapy would work, whether the cancer would return, or how much time she had left. But she could control how she spent whatever time remained, and she was determined to make every day count. The morning of her first treatment, Eleanor dressed carefully in comfortable clothes and her favorite scarf, one that Jennifer had given her for Christmas several years ago. As Bob drove them to the cancer center, with Jennifer following in her rental car, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She was about to begin the fight of her life, armed with cutting-edge medical treatment, unlimited love from her family, and a newfound appreciation for what truly mattered. The outcome was uncertain, but she was no longer facing it alone. The infusion center was filled with other patients receiving various cancer treatments, and Eleanor was struck by the quiet courage she saw in their faces. These were people who had also received devastating diagnoses, who had also been forced to confront their mortality, who had also chosen to fight for whatever time they could have with the people they loved. As the nurse inserted the IV and began the slow drip of medication that represented her best hope for survival, Eleanor closed her eyes and focused on gratitude rather than fear. Whatever happened next, she had learned something valuable about love, family, and the preciousness of time. 2 months into Eleanor's immunotherapy treatment, something unexpected began to unfold that would change everything. The pembrolizumab infusions were causing manageable side effects, fatigue that lasted for several days after each treatment, and a skin rash that made her look slightly sunburned. But the 3-week cycles had established a rhythm that the family was learning to navigate. Jennifer had temporarily relocated to Houston, taking a leave of absence from her law firm to be present for Eleanor's treatment journey. She'd rented a small apartment near the hospital and had thrown herself into the role of caregiver and advocate with the same intensity she'd once brought to her legal career. The transformation in their relationship had been remarkable, with daily conversations replacing the perfunctory weekly phone calls that had characterized their interactions for years. Bob had surprised everyone, including himself, by how well he was managing the emotional challenges of Eleanor's illness. His quiet strength had become the anchor that kept the family steady during the difficult days, and his practical approach to problem-solving had proved invaluable in navigating the complex medical system. But it was during Eleanor's 6th infusion appointment that Dr. Rodriguez delivered news that caught everyone completely off guard. Eleanor was sitting in the comfortable recliner in the infusion center, watching the clear liquid drip slowly through her IV line when Dr. Rodriguez appeared with a tablet displaying her latest scan results. "Eleanor, I have some remarkable news," Dr. Rodriguez began, her professional composure barely containing what appeared to be excitement. "Your 3-month follow-up scans show something I rarely get to report to melanoma patients with your initial staging." Eleanor felt her heart rate accelerate, and Bob immediately moved closer to her chair, taking her free hand in his. Jennifer looked up from her laptop, where she'd been working on some legal research, and gave Dr. Rodriguez her full attention. "The scans show no evidence of disease," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "No detectable cancer in your lymph nodes, no new lesions, no signs of metastasis. You appear to be in complete remission." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor stared at Dr. Rodriguez, trying to process words that seemed too good to be true. Complete remission for stage 3C melanoma after only 3 months of treatment was almost unheard of. A result that defied the statistical predictions they'd all been trying not to think about. "What does that mean exactly?" Bob asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It means the immunotherapy is working better than we dared hope," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Eleanor's immune system has responded to the pembrolizumab by mounting a powerful attack against any remaining cancer cells. While we'll continue the full course of treatment and monitor carefully, this is the best possible news we could have received." Jennifer began crying silently, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Eleanor felt numb with shock, unable to fully absorb the magnitude of what she was hearing. After months of preparing for the worst, the possibility of long-term survival felt almost impossible to accept. But even as the family celebrated this unexpected turn of events, Dr. Rodriguez was careful to provide appropriate context. Complete remission doesn't mean cure, she explained. Melanoma can recur years later, and we'll need to monitor Eleanor closely for the rest of her life. But this response dramatically improves her long-term prognosis. The drive home from the hospital that day felt surreal. Eleanor found herself looking at familiar neighborhoods and landmarks as if seeing them for the first time, or perhaps as if she'd been given the gift of seeing them again when she'd thought she might never have the chance. That evening, as they shared the news with Harold over dinner, Eleanor reflected on how profoundly the cancer experience had changed all of them. The disease that had threatened to destroy everything she valued had instead brought her family closer together and clarified what truly mattered in life. "You know," Harold said as they sat on the porch after dinner, "Martha always said that sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up teaching us the most important lessons about living." Eleanor nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The cancer diagnosis had forced her to confront her own mortality, but it had also awakened her to the preciousness of every day, every relationship, every moment of connection with the people she loved. Over the following weeks, as the reality of her improved prognosis began to sink in, Eleanor started making plans that extended beyond the next treatment cycle. She and Bob began talking about travel they'd postponed, projects they wanted to complete together, and ways they could give back to the community that had supported them through the crisis. Jennifer's transformation had been as dramatic as Eleanor's medical improvement. The high-powered attorney who had been too busy for regular family contact had become a woman who understood the fragility of life and the importance of nurturing relationships. She'd decided not to return to her previous position at the law firm, instead planning to start her own practice specializing in medical advocacy and patients' rights. The financial burden of Eleanor's treatment, which had seemed so overwhelming just months earlier, had brought unexpected blessings. Jennifer's willingness to sacrifice her own financial security for her mother's care had healed decades of misunderstanding between them. The medical bills that had initially seemed insurmountable had become manageable through a combination of insurance negotiations, hospital payment plans, and Jennifer's financial contribution. But perhaps the most profound change was in Eleanor's approach to her own health and well-being. The woman who had spent 40 years caring for others while neglecting her own medical needs had become a passionate advocate for early detection and preventive care. She'd begun volunteering at the cancer center, sharing her story with newly diagnosed patients and their families. "I tell them that catching it early makes all the difference," Eleanor explained to Bob one evening as she prepared for a support group meeting. "If I hadn't waited so long, if I'd listened to you and Harold from the beginning, maybe the treatment would have been simpler and less traumatic." Bob smiled at her, recognizing the woman he'd fallen in love with, but seeing new depths of wisdom and compassion that the cancer experience had revealed. "You're helping people now," he said. "That's what matters." 6 months after her diagnosis, Eleanor stood in her garden on a warm spring morning, examining the roses that were blooming more beautifully than she could ever remember. The surgery scar on her neck had faded to a thin, white line, barely visible unless someone knew to look for it. Her hair, which had thinned slightly during treatment, was growing back thick and silver. Jennifer was visiting for the weekend, and Eleanor could hear her daughter's laughter mixing with Bob's voice as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. The sound filled Eleanor's heart with a joy so profound it almost hurt. She thought about the small red spot that had started this entire journey, the tiny lesion she'd dismissed as insignificant for so long. In many ways, that spot had been the catalyst for the most transformative period of her life. It had nearly killed her. But it had also taught her how to truly live. The immunotherapy treatments would continue for another year, with regular monitoring for years beyond that. The threat of recurrence would always be present, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her life. But Eleanor had learned to live with uncertainty, to find joy and meaning despite the knowledge that the future was never guaranteed. As she tended to her roses that morning, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance she'd been given. Not just the medical miracle of remission, but the opportunity to rebuild relationships, to appreciate simple pleasures, and to use her experience to help others facing similar battles. The woman who had thought a pimple on her neck was too insignificant to worry about had learned that sometimes the smallest things in life can teach us the most important lessons about love, family, and the courage to ask for help when we need it most. Sometimes life's most frightening moments become our greatest teachers about what truly matters. Eleanor's journey from a dismissed pimple to a cancer diagnosis reminds us that our health concerns deserve attention and that the love of family can transform even our darkest hours into opportunities for deeper connection and renewed purpose. For those of us over 55, every symptom is worth investigating, every relationship worth nurturing, and every day worth celebrating with the people who matter most. Have you ever ignored a health concern that turned out to be more serious than expected? What life experience taught you the most about prioritizing what really matters? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.